Hi, my name is Darren Stevenson. Thank you for joining me. Today is Saturday, February 8th, 2014. It is 8 a.m. You're probably watching my YouTube channel. I can be found as the Darren Stevenson in San Francisco on Facebook if you want to join the conversation about some of these topics. I also have a blog at wondercloud.wordpress.com, and I run a website called organelle.org where you can see some of my the fossils of my intellectual and speculative development. I'm going to be talking today about probably one of the most important topics that very few of us have much understanding about. Most of us are aware that our world and our cultures are in crisis. We're in a very deep series of crises that are based on our behavior and our ideas. They're based on the way we interact with each other in the world, and they're based on primarily the models that we use to sort of build our cultures and activity around. And most of these ideas and models are badly broken. They have actually very little to do with reality and a lot to do with making models of things. Now, why would that be? We're going to find out a little bit about that today. Before we do that, first I'd just like you to take a look at my face. In fact, look at my eyes. And you may notice that one of them is different a little bit than the other. I'm not really sure because I can't look at them right now. I'm looking at the camera. But under my normal, in my normal circumstances, one of my eyes is a little droopier than the other. Now perhaps you can see which one that is. Now also, I want to just repair a problem, which is that this is my right hand. In case that looks different on the camera, in case it's reversed, the camera may be reversing the right and left sides as you would see them if you were actually facing me. So I want to make sure you know which side is which. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a couple of very important features. There are two basic forms of intelligence that are part of our lives and that are present on Earth. And these two forms of intelligence can be crudely understood as having been instanced in our brain structure. And what that means is that we are a bi-hemispheric creature. We have two brain hemispheres. And they actually compete. They have to compete for sugar or for basically the resources that are required to do what they do. The brain is a very, very expensive physiological organ. It requires huge amounts of energy to keep it running. And that's why when you're finally able to go to sleep and some of that energy is released, lots of amazing other metabolic things happen in your body. Now, I also want to make very clear that the brain hemispheres, although this is not absolutely true, and I want you to be aware that all the things that I'll be talking about today are generally true. They have exceptions. They're very complex. And although I'll be speaking in simple language, the actual situation is a bit more sophisticated than it appears. So keep that in mind. And what I want to say about the brain hemispheres to start out is my left hemisphere essentially, and of course my right is involved, but essentially controls the right side of my body. So this hemisphere belongs to this eye, this hand, this foot, and so on. My right hemisphere basically controls this side of my body, so that my right hemisphere controls my left eye, my left hand, my left side of my body. So there's this sort of crossover here, right? Like this, yeah? And this is true of almost every animal and even insects on Earth, although science hasn't really caught up with a lot of this yet. And this turns out to be very, very important. In fact, you will see when we're done talking, you're going to be able to learn lots of things about this topic, which is called hemispheric lateralization. And what that really means is, where are certain features of our minds and metabolism and cognition located on which side, and what do they do? Okay? And what we're going to discover is that one side of our brains has a vast, vast advantage in the world and in our minds and in our thought over the other. This is important in some ways, deadly in others. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And the first thing I want to say is that in order to speak language, we pretty much have to be using our left hemispheres. Okay? Our left hemispheres have to do with models, the way that we use them anyway, has to do with models and structure, linguistic communication, verbal communication. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, has more to do with orientation in space and is not particularly verbal. It's not that it has no access to language, and of course both hemispheres are involved, right? Neither of these things are totally true, right? They're not absolutely true. They're mostly true, so that it's mostly true that this side of the brain controls this side of the body, and that the left hemisphere is responsible for language. Now, if you've ever been in a situation where you thought you heard a secret voice, and it probably didn't say much, but what it said might have saved your life. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're approaching a green light, and everything looks fine, and you're going to drive through the green light. And suddenly you hear, sort of in your, you may not hear it physically, but you kind of hear in your mind, suddenly the voice like, stop, right? And so you slow down for a minute, and then just as you do that, you realize that a car goes speeding through its red light, and you'd have been killed if you hadn't stopped, right? And you might think, well, what was that? That was like my guardian angel or something, right? What just happened there? That wasn't even me that spoke. And you may have the feeling that it wasn't you speaking. That was your right hemisphere. This one, the one that normally doesn't talk, but may occasionally interrupt with a single phrase or a very small phrase, single word or small phrase in a situation where it's crucial that happen. And then you may have also heard the idea, the little voice, the quiet voice in your mind, like listen to that little voice. That's your right hemisphere, generally. And its purpose, primarily, is to interrupt the left hemisphere, which is like a galloping horse that just goes galloping, galloping, galloping along, pretending it knows everything about everything, and it doesn't pay any attention to anything that contradicts it in general. Now, again, I'm talking in generalities. When the left hemisphere is dominant, it basically owns the universe. And it believes everything that it's telling itself. It tells itself the wildest kinds of fictions and believes them madly. It will not listen to evidence to the contrary in general. And it's very tyrannical in a certain way, very self-interested, and essentially it thinks it's God. This is the hemisphere that runs all of our cultures, pretty much. It runs all of our collectives. It runs a lot of our lives. It runs our fascinations with technology. It's what's destroying nature outright. It's what makes war. It's basically responsible for most of the problems that we face, almost all of them. And so when we're confused about like why is our planet so messed up, why are our cultures and civilizations so damaged, mainly this can be placed on the plate of the left hemisphere. It will not be interrupted by data, and actually it doesn't care about living things really at all. It thinks of itself kind of as a theory or a machine, and it trusts everything that it says to itself endlessly, no matter how ridiculous that seems. Now, how do we know all this? Well, one of the ways we know is that people have strokes, right? Or certain kinds of people who have epilepsy, they have what's called a commissurotomy. Now, your brains are joined by a structure called the corpus callosum. And across this structure, a lot of communication occurs, but primarily what happens is the left hemisphere goes galloping along wildly, and occasionally when it gets in a lot of trouble, the right hemisphere interrupts it briefly and says, nope, stop. Okay, and the left hemisphere goes, what? Wait, a ghost just interfered. Well, where'd that come from? The reason that it feels that way is it actually does not believe in the other side of your body. It literally doesn't think it exists, and if it had its way, it would probably just shut it off or kill it, right? Notice that this happens to be the side of the body that your heart is on. This is not an accident. Listen carefully. We're going to learn some amazing things here together. So some people who have had strokes that damage the ability of the right hemisphere to interfere with the left, and so what that would mean is they're not really able to use the left side of their body anymore. This hand may be paralyzed, yeah? And when they're asked about the state of their body, they simply lie. They lie inveterately, so that, for example, if a person like this has had a stroke and they are asked, can you move your left hand? I say, absolutely. And so then the person will say, like, okay, go ahead and do that, and they'll go like this. And then the doctor will go, can you move your left hand? And they'll say, I just did. And so the doctor will actually like hold up their left hand and go, okay, so I want you to look in the mirror now, and I want you to tell me, can you move your left hand? And the person will say, yes, I can. And the doctor will say, okay, wiggle your fingers. And the person will go. And the doctor will say, can you see that you didn't wiggle your fingers? And I'll say, absolutely not, of course I wiggled them. Right? And so then, or the other thing that they'll say is just like, that's not my hand. So the doctor will say, like, whose hand is this? And they'll say, well, I don't know, it's not mine. My mom left that here or something. It's a wooden one. Someone get rid of that. I don't want to get that away from me, right? They'll be actually afraid of this side of their body. The weird thing about the left hemisphere, which of course is the right side of the body, is that it literally, in ordinary life, it doesn't believe in the other side of itself at all. And what it believes in are theories, descriptions, and models. Now you can try and understand the difference between a theory and a human being in a really simple way, okay? A theory is something written down on paper or a description in words. Words have nothing to do with beings. They're not even fictions. And in fact, without like your mind, they're nothing at all. They're not even objects. They're just nonsense. They don't even exist, right? So the left hemisphere really lives in this sort of church of theories and structures and ideas, and it wants those to be absolutely in dominance over everything, including like nature, being, whatever God there might be, science. It just wants absolute theory, absolute nothing to do with being. And in fact, in science, you're going to find lots of people who think things like the brain is a computer. Absolutely ridiculous. Okay, the difference between a brain and a computer is the difference between there's a difference between the sun and a charred matchstick. Okay, these are not the same order of phenomenon at all. But you've got scientists running around telling you your brain is a computer and your DNA is a computing network, and the universe is actually just a simulation in a giant computer somewhere. Right? These are people who've actually just basically gone insane. Right? Their left hemisphere has run away with them, and so they actually don't believe that there are living beings. They'll tell you straight up, you don't have experiences. And what you think of as experiences are just epiphenomenon, right? They're side effects of the mechanical functioning of your brain. They're absolutely out of their minds. Before we go any further, I want to go back in time a little bit, because we need to sort of get an idea of where this all came from and how it happened. And one of the things that's really surprising to discover is that you have other organs in your body that have neurons in them. And in fact, your brain isn't just your hemispheres, it isn't just in your head. Your brain is everything. Literally, it's everything. It's not connected to everything, it is everything. Your nervous system is throughout your body. Your entire body is your brain. What happens to be in your head is sort of the focused organs that organize and structure the relationships in your body and the behaviors of the different aspects. So the thing I want to talk about that's interesting is that for 6/7 of the history of life on Earth, so if you divide the history of life on Earth into 7 portions, okay, and you take away one of them, there's no brains. None. Nothing has brains. So for 6/7 of the history of life on Earth, there were no brains. None. And yet life on Earth was life. It did all of the complex things. It evolved. It built the ecosystems. It established the environment, the atmosphere, and everything without brains, right? So what was it using? Well, here's the amazing thing. It was using the gut. And actually, if you watch children, what you're going to see, really surprisingly, is that they put things in their mouth when they want to know about them, yeah? Because they're actually using the ancient intelligence system, which is your gut's filled with neurons, and they're a very unique form of neuron. Science knows very little about this. It's also filled with hypercultures of bacteria that can form fluidly changing networks of intelligence types. Yeah? So your gut is actually the original sort of root of intelligence and knowing on Earth. And essentially, when you think about it, what the brain is sort of an evolutionary flower that the gut very recently kind of set up and sent up into dominance, and it now dominates the world through our species. Now, ordinarily, that wouldn't be the case. If we were an animal species, we wouldn't be dominating the world for a simple reason. We would not have made billions of forms of object representations of functions. Functions, not beings, functions. And they compete against us, and we die. We burn down our ecosystems, we kill our children, we imprison each other, we wipe out our cultures, we poison the entire environment for the sake of representations of function. I'm talking about automobiles, computers, cars, cell phones, all of the roads, all of the hard structure that we build that wipes out or replaces living beings, living relationships, living transports, living networks of beings from whom our own minds and bodies arise moment to moment, just like a heartbeat. Okay, not in cause and effect, like a long time ago they established these things and that's how we got to be smart. No, 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 no. You wipe out those ecosystems, our intelligence and health dies right now, because it's emerging from all of the living relationships of Earth moment to moment, just like you are able to keep existing because your heart is beating. So if you start ripping your heart apart and replacing that with machines, what happens is catastrophic in your body. You may still be able to appear to be pumping your blood, but your heart, like your gut, is filled with neurons. Okay, and what that means is it has an infinite number of abilities and potentials and possibilities. It is actually an impossibility synthesizer, like your gut and your brain. It synthesizes possibility from impossibility or from super possibility. Yeah? And this is the most amazing and most crucial aspect of our bodies, right? Our guts and our hearts and our brains work together. All of the systems and organs of the bodies are intelligent, of our bodies are intelligent. All of them, right? Not just the brain, your liver, your kidneys, your circulatory system, your immune system is a particularly interesting form of intelligence. There's a whole network of forms of intelligence in the body that science is ignoring and saying, like, no, it's your brain. And that's actually, again, the left hemisphere talking, because it wants to become basically the only thing that exists and wants to shut out every other idea, being, place, etc. So when you get in a situation like this, where half of your body thinks the other half that doesn't exist, and that happens to be the half that has feelings, okay? That happens to be the half that has empathy, that can sense the realness and the sensitivity and the communion of other beings. Okay, so the right hemisphere is actually the communion hemisphere. What that means is not that we merely empathize with other beings. We are actually, Earth is one organism. Okay, so like our bodies, billions of forms of intelligence from which our own bodies emerge as an instance, not connected to it, right? We are the Earth. When you see animals and ecosystems being burned down, you're seeing your body being destroyed. Not an idea, not a separate thing from you. It's the same as if someone amputated part of your body and then barbecued it in front of you and said, don't worry, you only need this hemisphere and this side of you, okay? So that you can keep functioning in your job, right? So the left hemisphere is really all about functions. Not all about, again, there's some interplay, but it's mostly about functions, descriptions, theories, hypotheses, things we could say as if, it is as if, blah, 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 and then some theory comes out, yeah? All of our court systems and legal systems are based on this. They're fictions. All of our corporations are based on this. They're absolutely fictions. We compete against them. They wipe us out. They imprison us. They're destroying us. It's not that the left hemisphere is bad necessarily. When it's unguided by the anciently evolved intelligence of the right hemisphere, which is a very different form of intelligence, the left hemisphere becomes demonic, literally. Now, when people have strokes, this becomes very obvious because they lose access to all kinds of functions, and they actually just will tell you that side of my body doesn't exist. They have no ability really to empathize with other people, or very limited ability, and they just basically think of things as a machine, right? And it's a fictional machine that they're thinking about. It's not a real machine. Right? So when people tell you that you're a mechanism, or that mechanisms run your body, or that DNA is a mechanism, or that life on Earth has mechanisms or functions, they're actually just lying through their teeth. And the really weird thing about the left hemisphere is this. When people have these kinds of strokes and they ask them questions like, can you use the side of your body, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you shave the left side of your face? Someone will say, that's not mine. Someone else is supposed to take care of that. Right? And they're really worried about it too. It's like frightening. You can find some people who will actually, with certain kinds of brain states, will actually, the two sides of their body will fight. Right? It's like a woman will be attempting to pick a dress, and the left hemisphere will pick a very black, very very plain kind of dress, and the right hemisphere will want like the red, beautiful dress, and they'll actually be fighting each other, right? As the woman attempts to choose the dress physically, like rah, 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 but she's had a commissurotomy that separates the hemispheres, which helps people with certain kinds of epilepsy. So here's the really interesting thing. When you separate the hemispheres, what you find out is that the left hemisphere, it just lies wildly. It makes up fictions constantly. It believes them absolutely. It's uninterruptible. It won't accept any evidence to the contrary. You can show it any kind of evidence that it's wrong, it just overlooks it and pretends it doesn't exist. Much like our cultures do. Much like the aspects of our culture that are left hemisphere driven do. So, there's a way to sort of briefly in these people to change this, and an Italian neuroscientist discovered that if he put cold water in one of the ear canals of these people, that they would suddenly reconnect the hemispheres briefly, probably because the cold water causes shrinkage, right? And also compression of the tissues. And then, for a moment, they'd be able to tell the truth. So, he'll say, can you use your left hand? And they'll say, no, absolutely I can. And he'll say, move it. And they'll say, see, I just did, even though they didn't. And then the cold water goes in the ear, and he'll ask the same question, can you move the left side of your body? And they'll say, no, I can't. And he'll say, really? And they'll say, yeah, and I'm really sorry I've been lying about that the whole time. So you see, the right hemisphere is secretly aware of lies. It actually can tell. It's the lie detector, right? It knows everything about lying, and it can't tell lies. It just won't do it, right? It's like the good angel. It won't let that happen. It knows what the truth is in its simple, nonverbal way, and it interrupts the left hemisphere all the time to tell it, like, buddy, that story is not true. So that, for example, say you're standing on stage and you say, like, I'm the greatest guy there ever was. Immediately, your right hemisphere, if your mind's working correctly, is going to sort of interrupt you. You may blush and realize a time when you did something that was really mean or bad, and cruel. And so sort of the right hemisphere is constantly checking and interrupting the left. But let's talk about something a little more interesting. The left hemisphere is really good at tool use, making tools, using them, thinking about the world in functions and as objects. What does the right hemisphere do? Here's the surprising thing. Remember that story I told you about the stoplight? The right hemisphere is saving your life thousands of times per moment. It's the reason that you can even walk around. So you sort of have two different kinds of intelligence. And one of them is very focused and narrow. And this is sort of more the left hemisphere's style. The other one is very broad and diffuse. It doesn't have a particular identity, whereas the left hemisphere knows exactly who it is. It's a theory. It's an identity. It's a name, right? The right hemisphere is more like a dream. Yeah? It has some identity. It sort of knows who-ish it is. But that identity is very fluid and can change and flow. And it's also very intimate with what's ever going on right in the moment. So the identity of the right hemisphere is sort of like a flock or swarm of birds or a school of fish. It's changing shapes. It's parsing or it's interpreting and relating with the reality in billions of ways at once rather than two. Okay? And it's getting this sort of swarm-based intelligence that's changing and flowing and is just astonishingly anciently deep. And it comes from the much older aspect of organismal intelligence. It's very trustworthy. It's much more trustworthy than the left hemisphere ever is because it simply can't lie, and it's actually a lie detector. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that religion, most of it, especially the Western religions like Christianity and Islam, they're very left hemispherically based, right? They've made a description of God. Yeah? It was impossible, right? An absolutely ridiculous idea. And they believed the description and actually wrote a book, right? And said, this book tells the truth about the description of God, and if you don't believe this book, we're going to kill you, you're going to die, you're going to go to hell, and blah, 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 blah. It's completely left hemisphere fantasy. The left hemisphere has just risen up over everything in the universe and said, I am now God, I write the book of God, and you should believe me and listen to everything I say, and da-da-da, and if you don't, we'll kill you. Yeah? So this is really pretty wacky. When you see this happening in culture and you know something about the hemispheres, it's really surprising that we would allow this at all to happen, and that we would believe it is kind of even more surprising. By the way, I'm just going to adjust the video here there we go. So, essentially we live in cultures that are run by left hemispheric fictions, and science is their avatar, but weirdly enough, so is religion. It's got both of them, right? And it's uninterruptible. It will not listen, really, to any kind of evidence in general that says things like something's wrong. Now, scientists will listen to arguments that, how should I put it, that oppose their theories, but they do not realize at all that science is lethal. They don't see at all. They say like, well, we're just learning the ideas. What you guys do with that stuff isn't our fault, right? If you make nuclear wars or fill the world with deadly machines and poison every life form on Earth, we didn't do that, right? They're lying. Science is only what humans do with it, right? It doesn't exist as like an abstraction outside of that, right? Science can't say anything. It doesn't have a voice. All it has is people doing science and doing what they do with it. In other words, they enact the discoveries of science as functions, technologies, cultures, cultural trends, and things like this, and they're absolutely disastrous. There's never been a more deadly way of doing on Earth than science. And science likes to yell down at religion and say like, you're retarded, you don't believe in this, and you're killing everything, and you kill people for nothing, and da-da-da-da. That's the pot calling the kettle black, hugely, because science actually armed religion with everything it needs to do all of its crazy things when it does crazy things. And of course, when I say religion, I'm mainly talking about the left hemispheric-like religions of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, a lot of the others that have like story-based models of reality. There are also religions and spiritual paths that aren't much like that, that really want to get us to stop thinking, okay? Stop thinking about things and actually just settle down into a place where the constant dominance of the left hemisphere suddenly settles down, and now you get a little bit more of a play, right? And you can sense what it is to be rather than to think. And to be is not a function, it's not a model, it's not a machine. When you're being, you're actually being the entire universe of time, space, and history. You're not a machine, you're not a function, you're not a simulation, you're not an idea or a theory. Now, science really wants us to see the world through the lens, right, of theories and data and information. I want to be really clear about something. The living world and the living universe has nothing to do with information and data. Those are toys that we use to try to understand certain very sophisticated aspects of reality in incredibly, comparatively crude models. Those models are not the reality, okay? When I was a little boy, I asked my father what the sun was. And this is probably one of the most important questions a child could ask a parent, because the answer to this is going to affect the answer to everything on Earth. The reason is that everything on Earth is the sun. It's not distinct from the sun, right? Everything on Earth is the sun the same way my hand is me. There seems to be a separation between us and the sun. Yeah? Let me just tell you something. Shut off the sun for 1 instant. Watch what happens. Science disappears. All the beings die. There's no more religion. Mathematics is nonsense because there's no one to do it anymore. There's no language. All the books, all the art, all that stuff, useless garbage. There's nothing. Yeah? Turn the sun back on. Life comes back. If you get humans, all this stuff's meaningful again. Shut it off. It's gone. Right? And what that means is you're not connected to the sun. You and the sun are the same phenomenon. It's the same thing with time-space. It looks separate. What it is not separate. It's distinct. And each of those ways of being distinct, those are actually magical methods of becoming incredibly intelligent, because when you make things distinct in certain ways across which they then speak in very particular new vectors and transits and forces and abilities, you get amazing new potentials for development, intelligence, emotion, relation, all kinds of things. Yeah? But they're not really separate. So the important thing to understand is you and the world are the same phenomenon, right? It's your body. You and the world are the same, just the same way that an apple on a tree is the same thing as the tree. It's not really separate. It looks like a distinct phenomenon, but the tree and the apple are the same thing. And the apple actually contains within it, right, a seed, which is the entire tree encoded. Yeah? You are like that. You contain the seed of time-space itself. Yeah? The left hemisphere doesn't want you to know any of this, really, right? That won't fit in any theory it can produce. So that need to just throw that away. Anything we can't analyze, the left hemisphere wants that destroyed. It wants that just set aside. Can't analyze that. It's nonsense. So we just need to like get rid of that and pretend that everything's a theory. That's why they want you to think, for example, your brain's a computer, the universe is a simulation, all this kind of completely ridiculous nonsense. Let's come back to some other features of this. And we have these stories in the Bible, in Genesis, and there's stories like this in many other traditions, including indigenous American traditions. And they talk about the birth of two children. In the Bible, these two children are called Cain and Abel. Actually, it's more like Kana and Hevel, or something like that, yeah. And Kana means like a stick, okay? Like this, yeah? And Hevel means like mist, like fog or vapor, right? Like if you go on a mirror and that living mist filled with little millions of little particles, right? Making all these strange shapes that you can't see. That's Abel. Now these two kids get into trouble in the Bible, and Cain says something like, what you do is nothing, you know, I till the earth. And by the way, what does Cain do? He's a divider of things, yeah? He makes divisions in the earth, and he grows food from the divisions. So essentially he tills the earth. He's a divider of matter. That's the same thing as saying I divide mothers. That's the same thing as saying I'm the male generative organ, yeah? And so he kind of goes to Hevel, his brother, and says, you're not so interesting. In fact, I don't even understand about this God you guys believe in. Let's have a contest, you know. I'll bring the fruit of my work, and you bring the fruit of your work, and we'll see which one God likes better. Because he really wants to be free of his brother completely. He wants to just get rid of him, yeah, and say that, like, you don't even matter, right? Because what does his brother do? Now, what does Hevel do? He's a shepherd. What does that mean? Right? It means that he is the one who oversees the flowing, mist-like, multiple-bodied flocks, right? The schools and the murmurations of the birds. And he's the one whose intelligence lives in billions of forms and bodies that change and flow and are intimate and have no specific identity, right? And because he has no specific identity, Cain wants to say, like, you don't even exist. Right? You don't even have, you don't even matter, right? I'm the one that matters. I got my stick, my point, I touch things, they chop them, I make them happen. So if God's going to love anyone, he's going to love me because I do all the work and you do nothing. Yeah? All those flocks and everything could just live even without you. They don't need your help. So they have a little to do where they make an offering, and guess what happens? God doesn't like Cain's offering, and he likes Abel's offering. And Cain gets really angry. And this is another thing. Anger and rage, fear, frustration, these are really left hemispheric things here, right? The right hemisphere is not so worried because it's sort of formless and flowy. Since it can't really be trapped or captured, you can chop it in half, it doesn't even care. It's like water. Okay, chop the water in half. What happened? Did it hurt it? No, right? If you divide a flock into two things, if they go apart, does that hurt them? No, they just come back together. They're not worried in the same way about death, identity. The right hemisphere really has whole other situations that it's interested in, which I'll tell you a little bit about what that is in a minute. And a lot of it is like interrupting and getting just a little moment of a chance to be, how shall I put it, to get the sugar, right? To be the active hemisphere, so that it can interrupt the left when it's gone insane and bring the body and the mind and the soul and the spirit and the beingness, right, back into our experience and our feelings, right? Our ability to be with and be as one another, yeah? Communion, right? The flocks all together as one, right? So they have this contest. Cain gets really mad because God says, look, you know, you're being arrogant and crazy. Why do you hate your brother? He's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with him. He's not trying to, you know, be your boss or anything. And Cain's just furious. And so he hatches a plot, and he kills Abel, smashes him, bam, kills him. And then God comes and says, well, where's your brother? And Cain lies. He says, well, I'm not my brother's keeper. But actually he is, because he is now the person who saw the look in his brother's eyes in the last moments of his life as he slaughtered him over what? A fictional argument about who's in charge? Really? You killed your brother over that? Right? Yes, he did. And then he lies and says, I'm not his keeper. Well, how should I know? Right? So the first thing that Cain ever says, ever, in the Bible to God, is a lie. He's the father of lying. Literally, right? And this is exactly the left hemisphere. Yeah? And God, tries to correct him and says, this is not going to work, right? But what has happened here is actually we've seen, right, that we're seeing the history of human cognition. We're seeing that the brothers used to kind of play a lot more together, and then at one point, suddenly, this being my left, the left hemisphere attacked the right hemisphere and dominated it. Yeah. So that what would happen is it would become the left hemisphere dominated the right, and the right hemisphere would become the sort of underneath hemisphere. Yeah. So that we would now live like this. And what would happen is, while we're awake, totally dominated by the left hemisphere pretty much, with little interruptions from the right. But then when we're asleep, dreaming. Yeah? The flowing, changing identity. Yeah? The dreaming intelligence, anciently intelligent, without which our memories don't work. Right? You don't dream, you don't learn. You don't dream, you die. Your body can't even control its hypostasis. It can't control its temperature. Dreaming is absolutely integral to intelligence, to memory, to everything. The left hemisphere wants to think it doesn't even exist. That's just some nonsense you do at night. In fact, this is garbage processing. Just taking out the garbage. That's the left hemisphere's theory about dreaming. No, actually, if you couldn't dream, you'd never be intelligent. If you didn't have your right hemisphere, you'd never be able to understand language. You couldn't do mathematics at all, right? And Gödel proved this, Einstein's best friend, with his incompleteness theory. What he proved was it's impossible to have a system that doesn't have that extra unanalyzable aspect that makes it intelligible to us. But science has thrown his theory, which is concretely, astonishingly proven in two different ways, just threw it out the door. It doesn't even matter, right? Because they're really threatened by the idea that you can't make a perfect computational system. And by the way, the logical positivists, which were a movement that were attempting this, right? They wanted to set mathematics on a perfectly logical foundation forever. They failed. They spent 25 years trying to do it, and they realized not only did they fail, it's impossible. It can never, ever be done. And Gödel's theory was part of the proof that absolutely this is impossible. And what it means is every formal system has a hole in it. It's actually formed around that hole, and that hole leads up to a being that has to interpret and observe and understand when the system's gone haywire, when its results are nonsensical, when it's run away with itself. And that's what intelligence is, right? So a long time ago in the Bible, we had this story, and it's actually about our minds. And in fact, the tree incident that precedes it is the same problem, right? We've got communion, right, which means basically probably a little bit more of a right hemispheric dominance, right? We actually exist in other beings, as other beings, with other beings. Trees and flowers and bees and plants and all the animals are our bodies. We are in them. We see with their eyes, literally, not figuratively, right? Not in metaphysics, okay? Because we are actually one animal on earth. And then what happens is God says, don't go to the tree in the midst of the garden. Yeah? There's a very important thing about this word, the midst, and this tree, and there are two trees there, right? And the reason is that there's sort of there's an angel at this tree, and it's actually the angel of division. It's actually been involved in dividing the earth from heaven. And God knows that if the dirt children, us, we're made of dust, right? If we go to that tree, the angel children, basically the divider child, is going to share its toys with us. It's going to tell us how to make these weird divisions, right? How to see things as separate, yeah? And it's going to say, like, I just separated the earth from the heavens, and without me, God couldn't even have done that, and you could be like me. I'll show you how to do that. You can be gods. Yeah? And the children were very excited, and they learned the separation way. And once they got that idea of how to make a theory of something, and the snake basically tells him, like, oh, it won't really kill you. You're just going to it'll be as if you get godhood, as if, right? It gives them the potential for hypothesis, yeah? To think of models and to think as yourself as if you were separate, right? As if you were distinct from other beings, as if you were distinct from God. the outcome of this is catastrophic for us. Now, we might have been supposed to get that present at some point later in our developmental history, but we got it way too early. And so that's why the catastrophe happened, where it just totally overwhelmed and destroyed the other aspect of our mind, the communion aspect. And so what happens is they go to the tree, they eat the fruit, they learn, it's a new way of seeing is what they're told, which is absolutely true. Now you see things as separate. And once you see things as separate, you have theories about them. Well, if that's separate, what is it thinking about me? It might think, I'm naked. Maybe it's wrong to be naked. I better cover up my reproductive organs and the things that we make each other's lives, we renew life with, because those might be bad. Yeah? And so then God comes back, the sort of the right hemisphere, the communion intelligence interrupts and says, hey, why are you guys hiding? They're like, well, we're afraid. And I was like, afraid? But there's no such thing as fear. Why would you be afraid? Well, did someone tell you something? And then they said, well, we thought maybe we were bad. Or we're evil. And God was like, uh-oh. They went and talked to the snake. Now, by the way, the snake itself, this is a very complex thing. It's not actually a snake, right? In fact, what it is so shocking, I'm not going to get into that. But just notice something. The snake, by just doing what it does, by just moving, it divides the earth into two parts, right? If you look at a snake's trail, what you're going to see is a wavy line with half of the planet on this side and the other half on the other side, right and left, like our brains. So the snake basically gave them the division, yeah? It gave them the division between communion and distinction. And so we live in cultures that are totally based on the distinction aspect, and they're throwing away the communion. When they don't throw it away, they make ridiculous religions about it that are all theory and nonsense, and that override the actual capacities for communion, which are completely natural in all beings. They require no religion, no science, no anything. You just touch each other's hands and immediately you know, right? You feel, you are, you hold each other, you kiss, you see into each other's eyes, you feel, you're alive, you look at the living beings and you know, you feel them, right? It's not because you have mirror neurons. Right? Science wants to tell you you have these special neurons that allow you to pretend that you're having the experience of other beings. Bullshit. Okay? Those other beings are you. When you see other people tortured, you are tortured. When you see living beings killed and slaughtered, you're being killed and slaughtered, and you know it. You feel it right now. It's not a theory. It's not an idea. It's not because you're empathizing with them. It's not because of your mirror neurons allowing you to pretend you're participating in their experience. No, Earth is one organism. You can go out to space and see it. It's a fact. Okay? It's not a theory. There's no model here involved. One organism here. Whatever you do to nature is immediately done in our bodies and minds. There's no way around that. The left hemisphere wants you to believe that's all nonsense, right? Actually, it's just a bunch of functions and machines. You don't have to worry about anything. In fact, let's build as many machines as we possibly can and just populate the world with machines. We don't even need nature anymore. We don't need being. We don't need feelings. We're actually just computers, right? So let's build more computers, then we'll upload our brains into them, and then we can live in computers. It's essentially a schizophrenic, it's a psychotic fantasy. It's exactly the same fantasy that Cain had in the Bible. Now, by the way, in the indigenous stories, it's not precisely the same. And they really know about this because they show the two children. One of them is often called Slayer of Alien Gods, and the other one is often called Little Child of the Moon Waters, or something like this. And Slayer of the Alien Gods is often shown with a giant right hand, and the other child, Moonwater, is often shown with a giant left hand. They know exactly what was going on with this problem, and they knew it was deadly, and they were very cautious about it, and they knew it had to do with making representations of things, right? Pictures, images, theories, models. They stayed away from that stuff because they knew it was deadly poison, absolutely seductive, and if you gave it even a tiny foothold, it would rise up above you and kill everything, right? And they didn't recognize that when the white people from the West came, that these were actually the avatars of the right hand, right? They thought maybe they were the communion people from the sky, or maybe at least they were just people, right? That they were actual people. They weren't people. They were actually monsters, literally monsters, organized in armies by the Left Hemisphere, which is running all of our cultures, all of our governments, all of our economic systems, and wiping out nature right now because it's become a god, literally. Again, in the Bible, when Christ goes into the desert and he has his encounter after 40 days of fasting with the devil, this is exactly what's going on. The left hemisphere is coming and saying, okay, you've made it, right? You've become a power. I can see you missed, child. He's representing Abel all over again. And by the way, the world's going to crucify him because he's the missed child, right? He's the one, the communion intelligence, where he just comes and people instantly fall into communion all around him, right? They suddenly experience unity. They know it as a fact. And the magical powers of that communion, those powers are so far beyond science and religion that if 1/1,000,000th of them were revealed, religion would be wiped off the face of the earth, and science would be completely destroyed in its current incarnation, and would accelerate like 1,000,000 years in a year. Because the intelligence of the right hemisphere is 1,000,000,000-fold more powerful and older than that of the left. It is actual intelligence. It's not based on models. It's based on intimate, actual communion power. So you can just link minds in webs and shockingly magnify their sensing and intelligence into impossible superpositions, right? Impossibly profound, unbelievable experiences that won't even fit in language. There's no language that can contain them. There's no description that can contain them. There's no religion that can contain them. There's no theory that can contain them. No machine will ever come anywhere even vaguely into the proximity of these kinds of expressions of being and the intelligence of true being. Now, there's another thing I want to talk about briefly about the right hemisphere, which is this. It orients you in space. Now, you have two basic sorts of vision, and they correspond to the two kinds of intelligence. The foveal vision is what you see very specifically with. It's very detailed, gives you color, gives you detail. Yeah? But the peripheral vision is actually what keeps you alive. Okay? It's what allows you to navigate in space, to move, to do impossible calculations that you would never be able to do 1,000,000,000 times a second, so that you don't just kill yourself by running into things over and over and over again. Now, what I really want to make clear is that comparing these two forms of intelligence, the foveal vision, the central vision, is very, very important and crucial. But compared to your peripheral vision, it's actually dumber than a rock. Okay? Your peripheral vision is astonishingly intelligent. It can tell what something is by glancing at it for an instant. It doesn't have to see the whole thing either. It can see like part of a person's ear from 15 feet away, and it'll know immediately who that person is. Whereas the foveal intelligence needs to see the whole person to know who that is. So essentially, what we call intuition, this is the right hemisphere's whole domain, right? And it's not intuition. What it is billions of minds, billions of them, in swarming flows, checking like the tiniest little hair of change and knowing exactly what that means instantly, and modifying your whole metabolism and allowing you to do things that would be otherwise completely impossible, right? If you had to depend upon this intelligence to survive, you wouldn't be able to do anything, right? Nothing. You wouldn't even be able to understand language, because without the superposition of millions of minds and ancient intelligence that the right hemisphere comprises, this thing is basically a piece of junk. It doesn't do diddly squat, okay? And yet it's our God in our religion. So when Christ was in the desert, he was meeting this power. Yeah? He was meeting the left hemisphere, and it came and said, I'll give you power over everything. You can, the nations, And the missed child said, I don't need power. I'm not a power kind of guy. This is actually Cain and Abel all over again, right? And of course, the missed child comes, the communion child comes to human experience, and invariably they crucify them, they kill them, they chop them down, they say you don't matter. Religion itself will actually kill the missed child when it shows up. Now, in the indigenous stories, this doesn't happen the same way. In the indigenous stories, these two children work together in a fascinating way that keeps them both alive, and they realize like they need each other to be anything at all. In effect, what's really supposed to happen is that the communion intelligence is supposed to wield the individual intelligence sort of like an experimental laboratory for development, right? And also like a tool, yeah? But what's happened is the reverse. The tool has become the God and wants you to think you're actually just a tool, okay? So you can see this throughout our cultures, and you see the effect, right? the governments don't actually care about people at all. What they care about is theories, economies, money, which is a representation, machines, which kill every living thing. Those cars that surround our city blocks, that all the streets belong to them, and all the structure we've made, and they just poison every living thing. They're an unthinkable kind of elitist luxury that none of us should have anything to do with, really. I mean, cars are one of the deadliest technologies we've ever developed, but all of our technologies are pretty deadly because they're competing against being and ecosystems and intelligence, and they're winning. They're not winning like a little bit. They're winning catastrophically, just like Cain won over Abel. So I want you to understand is we need to really realize that stories and being are not the same thing, that most of our intelligence is hidden in something a lot more like dreaming and loving and feeling, a communion form of intelligence that's instantly accessible to us without any kind of description at all. That the peripheral way that you see, right, if you're looking at the sky, you'll see like way off here, where you're not even looking, you'll see 3 or 4 stars that are so dim that if you look right at them, you can't see them at all. They don't even exist. But if you look away, bing, 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 there they come again. Yeah? And this is the nature of the right hemisphere's intelligence. It sees everything, even though it doesn't have focus and doesn't use color, right? It sees things that are completely invisible to the highly focused left hemisphere that is sure that it's God, is sure that all of its descriptions are facts, and really wants to just dominate and destroy all living beings. It doesn't care a bit about anything alive. It doesn't care at all. It just has its theory, its book, its money, its representation, its machine, and that's all it cares about. Those are actually the instances of its godhood, and it wants to rule everything. And by the way, ruling, right, is it's a measuring stick, right? You make distinctions, have little separations here. This is Cain's toy, yeah? This is Cain's toy, the number system, right? And the amazing thing about that is that the number system doesn't work without Abel. And this is what Gödel proved, essentially, right? Kurt Gödel. He proved that there's no way to make sense of mathematics without that without the intelligence upon which the capacity to discern is actually founded. Yeah? So understanding these things is really astonishing because you'll recognize, in fact, even watching this video, you're going to see that I'm using my hands differently. You're going to see that one of my eyes is a little bit droopier than the other. You see, sometimes I turn my head this way and sometimes I turn my head this way. Have you ever been watching a dog and you suddenly see it go like, boink, right? As it looks at you and raises like one side of its head? It's showing you something, right? It's showing you, and usually it's the eye that it's showing you that matters. So if it raises this eye, it means this hemisphere is going on. If you watch birds, they're going to do something even more interesting. They're actually going to turn like this and look at you with one eye, right? And then they're going to turn and look at you with the other eye. And when they do this, they're actually switching minds, okay? They're switching the evaluative mind, that they have to determine whether this is something I should be afraid of, whether it's a threat, and then they're turning the communion mind, whether I can relate with this, and what's the relationship based on. You're going to find the same thing even in insects, okay? So when you watch living beings, they're going to constantly be giving you physical signals in their facial expressions, in their eyes, in which side of the head is tilted up and down, that will be literally signaling you about what the relationship between the hemispheres is in the moment. And as you learn more about this and you learn to observe this in other people, you're going to be very surprised at what the results are, because you're going to be able to tell things like they're making up a story or that this is something they really feel. Now, most of our engineers and scientists are vastly left hemispherically dominated, so they really don't tend to have the same kinds of capacities for empathy, for feeling other beings, for being, because they've sort of practiced themselves, or maybe they might have some kind of a mental situation or cognitive situation, like ADHD or what we call Asperger's, which really hyper-evolves the left hemispheric assets. These people tend to be expert pattern matchers, profoundly geniuses at mathematics, but they're not very good at empathizing with other people, and they tend to be paranoid. That's the other thing about the left hemisphere, is that the left hemisphere is paranoid. It's afraid of everything because there's a ghost, right, in the right hemisphere that actually kicks it out of the body at night. when you dream. It doesn't want that, right? It can't stand that idea that it's taken over by a ghost that doesn't even exist. The thing doesn't even have an identity as far as the left hemisphere is concerned. So really, it wants that dead. It wants to kill it. And there's millions of bizarre representations of this, including alien abduction and many other things that really have to do with left hemisphere dominance, radically, explosively rising into new forms and instances of expression and extreme structure. Yeah? And there's a couple of further things I want to say about this. Schizophrenia, and when people have sort of like paranoid, grandiose fantasies, this left hemisphere all the way, right? They're paranoid, they're frightened, they feel threatened, they want to make war. It's all left hemisphere stuff. The right hemisphere is really hard to threaten. It just doesn't have an identity. It doesn't feel fear that way. And what's really interesting is that if the left hemisphere can get you to feel fear, if it can get you to feel frustration, fear, or anxiety, right? It's actually going to shut down probably 80% of your ability to feel, be, and be intelligent, and also to interrupt that, right? So the more it can frighten you, the better chance it has of winning the game of staying dominant, which is really what it wants to do sort of in general. It wants to just remain dominant, never be interrupted, never be questioned, and just breed theories and fictions like mad, and then make you worship them and convert you to their agents and make you defend them and all this kind of thing. Which if you look in our cultures, is exactly what's going on. The United States basically terrified the entire population, which they didn't have to do no matter what happened on 9/11. It doesn't matter who did that, right? No matter what happened in history, it doesn't matter who did that. Once the population is terrified, the intelligence falls, the left hemisphere rises, and it can just own us, literally. It'll do whatever it wants. It'll wipe out the environment and tell us, well, that's absolutely necessary to protect you. Yeah. Completely deadly lies. So in understanding these things together and being able to talk about them and observe them both in each other, in our relationships, in science and religion, in our cultures, in all the things that we do, we gain the ability to return back toward the communion intelligence, which we can experience instantly with no theories, no religion, no science, nothing, right? Nothing for sale, no books. The right hemisphere does not care about artifacts at all. The left hemisphere absolutely wants artifacts to rule everything. In fact, there are many very intelligent scientists who literally believe, that we should just take the solar system apart and turn it into a giant supercomputer made of nanocomputing dust that orbits the sun. No more organisms. Pure representation. They also believe that you can upload your mind into a machine. Completely ridiculous idea, because your mind, first of all, isn't in your head, it's in communion with all beings on Earth and in all of time-space. And you may think that because planets are separated by impossible distances and all of this, that means we're not touching their minds. You're wrong, actually. Fundamental to the nature of the universe is unity. Secondary is distinction. Yeah? But we've got this turned around. Fundamental is distinction, and unity is well, maybe that exists. We've had a really amazing chance together to get a glimpse into hemispheric lateralization. I want you to also, before I go, realize one thing. The assets in the right hemisphere are connected to your heart and your gut, the two oldest forms of intelligence on Earth, billions of times older than the brain at all. And compared to the left hemisphere, the difference in, how should we put it? The difference in intelligence between your heart, gut, and right hemisphere is a unity, right? And the left hemisphere would be like the difference between Einstein and a pencil. Now imagine if a pencil wanted to become God and then actually succeeded, okay? That's where we're at on Earth. And I want to be really clear. Every single problem we are facing as cultures, as human beings, our problems with human rights, our problems with the environment, our problems with pollution and poisoning everything, all of them can be laid at the foot of the left hemisphere dominant, paradigm. And so once we begin to understand this, and we can learn together how, and we don't want to destroy or attack the left hemisphere, but we can learn that fear is its weapon, anxiety is its weapon, lying is it's made of lies, it is the father of lies. The greatest trick the devil ever played wasn't pretending that he didn't exist. It was pretending that he did, right? Because the left hemisphere it lives in theory, right? The devil is a theory of the left hemisphere, and it wants you to believe that, because once you're scared of that, you're owned by that, right? So Understanding these very simple features of our cognitive and the nature of our intelligence and our bodies and our relationship with nature is so powerful that this knowledge just by itself can lead us into an entirely new evolutionary phase and can actually help us to solve all of the problems on Earth, to reestablish something like our communion intelligence, which again is not religious, not scientific, and not a description. It's actually just the way we are as beings, incredibly, possibly sophisticated organisms in an unthinkably ancient, unified planetary intelligence that's linked to all of the intelligences in time and space instantaneously, no separation at all. Let's get a taste of what we lost when Cain killed Abel. And let's try and understand what this story about Christ being crucified is really about. And by the way, I was born on Christmas. Thanks for joining me. We've got a lot more to learn together, and I'm really excited to be learning it with you. Bye-bye for now.